I used to be a delivery driver for a small pizza chain in the town I grew up in. I had my share of bizarre things happen while delivering pizza, but one story stands out that was absolutely terrifying. While working one night, I was in the back doing dishes. My manager let me know that a delivery would be up in about 10 minutes. I finished up what I was doing and proceeded to look up the address of the delivery. The delivery was about 3 miles or so from the shop. I had to travel about 1.5 miles down a particular back road that connected to a large neighborhood. This road wasn't necessarily rural, but it was the part of town that had homes that weren't very close together. As I was coming down this street, I could see that there was something up ahead on the side of the road. It was dark out by this time, so at first I couldn't tell what it was. Once I got closer, I could see what looked to be a person laying on the ground, just off to the side of the road. I then noticed a car nearby, also on the side of the road. Suddenly, a second person emerged, waving their hands wildly and urging me to stop. My first instinct was that an accident had occurred and someone might have been seriously injured. The thought that something else was going on had never crossed my mind. This accident was a pretty good hike from the nearest house, and being 2005, not everyone had cell phones back then. So the idea of these people being unable to reach help after an accident was plausible. I pulled my car over to the side of the road, got out, and asked the guy what happened. He looked to be about 30 years old or so. The guy laying on the ground was face down. The guy told me he was driving and lost control of his car. He said he went off the side of the road and almost flipped his car, and that his friend was ejected through the passenger side window. He told me he was afraid to try to move his friend. He said he tried finding a pulse but couldn't. He said he also wasn't sure if he was checking the right spot and asked me if I could check. I don't know a ton about the human body, but I do believe I could find a pulse if one was present. I walked over to the man on the ground and kneeled down. Just as I was about to try to find a pulse, I was struck from behind on the back of the head. The blow knocked me down but didn't knock me out. I rolled over on my back and was immediately looking up at a gun pointing towards me. The man who said he wrecked his car had the gun. At that point, his friend suddenly got up. I went from being extremely confused to having dread set in, all within about a second. The men ordered me up and told me to get into the driver's seat of my car. I was followed by the man with the gun, who repeatedly told me that he would shoot me if I yelled or tried to run. Once we were in my car, the man ordered me to start driving. He told me to follow the car in front of us, which was being driven by his friend. I began telling him that he could have all of my money and my car. He kept telling me to be quiet. After about 10 minutes of driving, his friend parked his car. He got out of his car and ran over to get in the back of mine. The men told me to start driving again. Again, now with both men in the car. I told them they could take any of my stuff. I just asked them to let me go. I was again told to be quiet. They said as long as I did what they said, I would be fine. But we were beginning to drive towards the town I lived in. This town actually did have some rather secluded and rural areas nearby. I decided that if they didn't want my money or car, and were forcing me to drive us to a rural area, they were going to kill me. I began thinking why? Why me? What motive could they possibly have to kill me? Then I thought about it some more. I decided that if someone was crazy enough to murder people, they didn't need any real type of motive to begin with. So many things started going through my head. I pictured what it would do to my parents. I tried thinking of any way I could somehow persuade these guys not to kill me, or a way to fight them off. I even thought about the customer who was probably wondering where their food was. I thought about wrecking the car with all 3 of us in it, but then I decided that I would probably be killed in the accident too. Or if not, one of the guys would shoot me. While still sitting in silence, thinking about all of this, the man with the gun told me to turn onto a road that I happen to be quite familiar with. I was particularly familiar with this road because it led to one of my best friend's houses. I would drive this road regularly, going to and from there. I started thinking about where these guys were taking me, and then I had an idea. Further up on this road, there is a rather sharp curve to the left. I am familiar with this turn, and I know how dangerous it is. If you were to go straight instead of following the curve to the left, you will drive off a rather steep embankment. It was probably a good 20 feet down and ran into some trees. I decided that as I slowed to take the turn, I would make a dive for it out the door. Luckily, I didn't think to put my seatbelt on before I started driving. As I drove down the street, getting closer to the turn, I was praying that I wouldn't be instructed to turn off the road before we got there. At the same time, I was also trying to mentally prepare myself for jumping from a moving vehicle. I knew that I would have to slow down for the curve anyway, so I shouldn't end up with any serious injuries. I began to wonder if by the time I jumped out, either man would have enough time to react and jump out as well. I knew this was my only chance and I had to go for it. Luckily, we made it past the last street we could have turned off onto, and the curve began quickly approaching. This was it, do or die. The curve came up, and I waited until the absolute last possible moment. I then opened my door and threw myself out as hard and as fast as I could. I heard one of the men yell something and looked up to see the man in the front of the car reach for the steering wheel, but it was too late for him, and the car went off the road and down the hill. I lost sight of the car, but I was able to hear it when it crashed into something. The impact sounded loud, but I was unsure of how badly either guy was hurt. I began running as fast as I could. I tried checking my pockets for my cell phone but couldn't find it. I wasn't sure if I'd left it in the car or if it had fallen out of my pocket while exiting the car. I didn't turn around to look. I continued running until I reached a house. I knocked on the door and frantically explained what happened. The homeowner called the police. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They located my car and found one of the men inside. The man had rather extensive injuries. The other man was found minutes later and had less serious injuries. The police later revealed to me that the man they interviewed told them that they just planned on robbing me of my cash and my car. They said that they were driving me to a location that was so secluded so they had time to get away before I could call the police. Nothing in either of the men's backgrounds suggests they had anything worse in mind than robbing me, but I still have to wonder. I am extremely fortunate that the situation only cost me my car and nothing more. If I ever find myself driving up on a situation like this again, I will be calling 911 for the people, but not stopping my car. Although things could have ended worse, this was still the most terrifying experience of my life. This is an ongoing story for me. I recently turned 30 years old, and throughout my life, I've always been a skeptic when it came to anything related to the paranormal. It's not that I absolutely believe that the paranormal didn't exist, I just had my doubts. I had heard stories from other people, but I had never experienced anything myself, even when I went to places that were supposedly haunted. I had gone with friends to places that allegedly had spirits or ghosts occupying them, but aside from being a little nervous in those super creepy places, I hadn't experienced witnessing any ghosts or any other weird activity. Over the years, as my friends and I got a bit older, we stopped going to those kinds of places so often. About 3 months ago, my friend Justin called me and asked if I want to go to an abandoned hospital. It used to house patients who were sick with tuberculosis. Then it turned into a mental institution. Eventually, the treatment of the mental patients was exposed, and the institution was shut down. Apparently, there were a variety of things done to patients that ultimately got it closed down. Some of the patients were neglected, left sitting in their own urine and feces and barely fed. Others were punished for their behavior by being physically beaten. There were even reports of certain staff members making patients engage in a fight with one another. The list goes on, and many patients died while living at the institution. Unfortunately, this was only one of many institutions that were exposed and shut down in the past. This particular place was closed down about 30 years ago or so. Since then, it's been left abandoned, slowly falling into ruins as nature reclaims its ground. Anyway, Justin said that there were a handful of our friends that were going to explore it. It did sound intriguing to me, and there were also a few people I wanted to see that I hadn't seen in quite some time. So I made an awful decision and agreed to go with them. It was about a 2-hour drive before we got there. We were all pretty excited to see the place. It felt like old times again with my friends as we joked around on the ride there. We used the GPS on our phones to find the location, but the address we put in brought us to the wrong place. We turned around and headed back to a gas station we had passed a couple miles back. There was a younger girl working at the gas station. We asked her about the institution and if she knew where the place was. She had a puzzled look on her face, but did tell us how to get there. Luckily, our GPS took us to the general location of the place, so we only had to travel maybe another 10 minutes. When we got there, we could barely see the roof of the building. It was gated up, and there were a lot of plants and weeds overgrowing the gates. As expected, there were also signs that said no trespassing, but we experienced those signs more than half the time we go to places like this. I remember checking my phone and it was almost 6 o'clock. We timed our trip out so that we'd get there just as it began to get dark. Justin parked his car about a quarter of a mile down the street, as to not draw attention to the place and blow our cover. We all got out of the car and began walking to the building. Once we got there, I climbed about halfway up the fence so I could get a better look at the place. It was quite decrepit looking from what I could see at that point. We found a better spot to climb over the fence safely. We made our way to what appeared to be the main entrance. As expected, the door was locked, but since it was in such bad shape, our friend Mike was able to push the door and force his way in. We shut the now broken door as best as we could and headed inside. At this point, we pulled out our flashlights and began to look around. It really looked the way I expected, just a broken down building that had been rotting away for years. There wasn't anything too shocking in the main room. You could tell that someone had made a weak attempt at cleaning the place out in the past. There were random things left behind, nothing too out of the ordinary. Some busted up wheelchairs, old hospital beds, a lot of scattered papers and trash. As we walked room to room, we tried to take our time so we didn't get split up. My friends brought a couple voice recorders, and I entertained the idea that we might pick up some spirit voices on them. To be honest, at this point, I was mostly afraid of getting caught by the police and charged with trespassing. We spent about 20 minutes walking through this place, recording what we could, and asking the so-called spirits questions. Suddenly, we heard a loud thud. It sounded like it came from the basement. We spent a good 5 minutes walking around until we finally found a door that led us to a staircase to walk down to the basement. It was surprisingly empty. My friends kept asking questions out loud. At this point, I started to mock these so-called spirits. Then it happened. Suddenly I found myself coming to, with my friends yelling at me, saying, "Let's go! Let's go!" Being totally confused and feeling foggy, I just followed them as we walked as quickly as possible without tripping over anything. Once we got out of the hospital and past the fence, my friends kept asking me if I was okay. I kept saying yes and asking them why they kept asking me that. Apparently in the basement there was a large flash. At first, someone thought someone took a picture. Then they realized no one did and found me in some weird type of trance. I guess for several minutes, they kept saying my name and I wasn't replying. I was just standing there with a blank expression on my face. I honestly thought they were playing a joke on me, despite how sincere they acted. The drive home was pretty normal, despite my friends talking about how freaked out they were when it came to how I acted while I was there. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I took a shower and went right to bed. I fell asleep almost instantly. I slept well until I was woken up by a thud. I checked my phone, it was around 2:30 a.m. I wasn't about to get out of bed to explore the noise. I assumed it was probably nothing and tried to go back to sleep. I tossed and turned for about 10 minutes and decided I would give up for now and read a book. That was the first time I saw it. I looked over, and in the corner of the room, there was some dark apparition. It was more like a shadow. It was almost human shape, but not quite. Frozen in fear, I did the only thing I could think of, and covered myself up in blankets. From there, I couldn't hear anything. But it was like I could feel this apparition inching closer and closer to me. Soon, I could feel, whatever it was, standing right next to my bed. The seconds ticked by, which felt like hours. Nothing was happening. I was just lying still in fear, covered up by blankets like a child hiding from the boogeyman. I honestly can't say how long I laid there like this, but when I finally peeked out from the blankets, it was gone. At this point, I came to the conclusion that I was going crazy. I called Justin. I wanted to ask him more about how I was acting at the hospital, as I was fearing I was having a mental breakdown. I hit call on his number, and with only one ring, he answered by saying, "Matt, are you okay?" I told him I wasn't sure. He said he had just been woken up by a nightmare. He said it was about me at the hospital. He said we were in the basement, and suddenly, some large black mass came up behind me. It began wrapping itself around me, ripping me apart. At that point, he woke up, and was looking at his phone, trying to distract himself from what he had just dreamt. Then, right after, it was me calling him. I told him what I had just experienced, and that I was afraid I was losing my mind. He told me he believed it was something else, and asked me if I wanted to come stay at his place. I lived alone, in a one-bedroom apartment, and at this point I wanted out of there. Plus, I didn't want to be by myself. I headed over to his house. By the time I got there, it was starting to get light out. I went to sleep on his couch, and slept fine without any incident. He was home when I woke up. It was the weekend, so neither of us had work. He even canceled on his girlfriend to kind of watch over me while I slept. We have been friends for our entire lives, so we are more like brothers than friends. After waking up, we kind of debriefed on what had happened over the past 24 hours. I kept telling him I really thought I was beginning to lose my mind, but he was convinced it was something paranormal, something that happened to me at the hospital. He has had experiences in the past, so he believes strongly in the paranormal. He said that my disbelief caused me to have my guard down while I was at the hospital, and that I probably angered the spirits by mocking them. He spent time researching while I was asleep on his couch. He says that he believes the spirit has attached itself to me, basically that I was possessed or something. At this point, I really wasn't sure what to believe, but I really did trust Justin. We decided we were going to just see where things went and play the situation by ear. I knew I had to return home. I made sure to go home while it was still light out. I spent time doing normal stuff, and also read up about what was going on with me online. That night, I went to bed with the hallway light on. I was very nervous I would have a similar experience to the prior night. I spent a while lying in bed, reading stuff, watching videos, looking at Facebook, etc. Eventually I fell asleep. I woke up in the morning feeling very relieved. My life went on to being quite normal for a while. I had almost forgotten about what I had experienced, and written it off as me having a weird experience caused by too much stress in my life. I had fallen asleep one night. I remember having a bad dream. I don't recall the details, but I remember being crushed by something in this dream. I woke up to feeling this intense pressure on my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I instinctually went to push something, whatever it was, off of me, but there was nothing there. Finally, the pressure went away. I took a huge gasp of air. By this point, I was all the way awake. I was partially sitting up in bed, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Before I had a chance to really give it some thought, I heard noises start coming from downstairs in my apartment. My apartment has a bedroom and bathroom upstairs. Downstairs is the living room and kitchen. It sounded like someone was in the kitchen, going through my belongings. I remember how loud it was. Pots and pans banging around, dishes being loudly rifled through. I couldn't believe that someone trying to burglarize my apartment would be so careless and loud. I grabbed my baseball bat from my closet and slowly began to walk downstairs. I didn't know who was in my apartment or how many people were involved. I didn't know whether or not they were armed. I decided it would be best if I surprised them downstairs while they were still busy looking through stuff, rather than waiting for them to come upstairs and find me. I got to the top of the staircase and slowly inched my way downstairs, one step at a time, making sure I walked on the sides of each step so I didn't make any noise. By this point I was trembling with fear, but I was ready to fight for my life. I finally made it to the end of the staircase. As soon as my foot hit the living room floor, the noise stopped. I figured they must have heard me. I stood frozen in fear. I tried to quiet my breathing so I could hear anyone move or come my way. I continued to hear nothing. Finally, I said, "I have a gun. Just leave now or I'm going to use it." Still nothing. No response in any way. I slowly moved over towards where the light switch was. I had given away my position. Now I wanted to know where he or they were. Before I could reach the switch, I stumbled over some of the wreckage in my apartment. I expected to be rushed at this point, as I halfway fell down. I hurried to my feet, and there was still nothing. I finally got to the light switch. I flipped it on, with my eyes directed towards the kitchen. I wasn't able to see anyone. I looked around, shocked at how much of a wreck my place was. It looked like a tornado had come through it. I slowly walked to the kitchen. I was only able to see into it partially at this point. I had the bat in my hand, walking while ready to swing. I finally got to the kitchen, ready to make my assault. But no one was there. I looked in the closet, I looked all over, even into the cabinets, but I wasn't able to find anyone. I was so confused. Where did they go? My apartment was absolutely trashed. I didn't notice anything missing, but it was hard to tell. I noticed my TV was still there, my PlayStation was still there, just about anything with any value was still there. I even found my wallet on the ground. I had left it on the counter in the kitchen along with my keys. The cash in my wallet was left untouched. I found my car keys too. Finally, I checked my windows and door. Everything was locked. There was no way someone got in here, and they would have had to have gone past me to leave. I was already downstairs once the noise stopped. The door and the windows were next to me. Suddenly, what happened at the hospital, along with what I experienced later that night, flashed into my head. I didn't want to believe any of that had anything to do with what had just happened. For whatever reason, burglars would have been a lot easier for me to cope with. I decided to call the police. Maybe they could find something I missed. They came by a short while later. I told them what happened. They weren't able to find any sign of forced entry. They said I either must have been mistaken about everything being locked, or that someone had a spare key. I told them I didn't have any spare key. They took down some info and asked me to call them again if anything else happened. I spent all morning cleaning up and went to work. This was one of the few times I was looking forward to going to work. I told Justin what happened. He had no clue what to say, aside from thinking it had something to do with the paranormal. I just refused it could be something related to that. A few nights went by with no incidents. Then I went to bed one night. I remember it was Saturday night. I went out with some friends and got home late. I ate, watched some TV, and then retired to bed. I was exhausted. I fell asleep quickly. It was one of those nights where I don't remember trying to fall asleep. I only remember laying down. The next thing I remember, I woke up sweating. I felt so hot, even though it wasn't hot outside. I flipped the pillow over and pulled my blanket off me. I rolled over and tried to fall back asleep. As I was lying there trying to sleep, I began to hear loud breathing. At first, I thought I was hearing my own breathing, but it sounded weird, so I began to hold my breath. And even then, the breathing was growing louder and louder. At this point, chills ran through my entire body. I had the most intense butterflies in my stomach. I hesitantly opened my eyes and looked in the direction I heard the breathing coming from. That's when I actually saw it up close. I could tell it wasn't an actual person. Maybe it was at some point, but I knew I was seeing a ghost. A woman, standing at the foot of my bed. She had a look of terror on her face, with her mouth hanging down, far open. Her mouth was open much larger than any human could open their mouth. Part of me was frozen in absolute horror, while the other part of me was astonished at what I was seeing. She looked to be an older woman. I can't really describe any other features. She was like an apparition with a face. This went on for only a few seconds before I decided to run. I nearly fell out of my bed as my feet got tangled in the blankets. I ran downstairs, grabbed my keys, and ran outside. I got in my car and drove to Justin's. I told him what happened. He's had his own experiences, so he didn't seem so shocked. He believed me, and it felt good to have someone who actually believed me. A few nights ago, we decided to try to contact the spirit. Justin owns a Ouija board, so he brought it over. We decided to try to contact the spirit in my bedroom, where most of the activity has occurred. We got everything set up and began asking the spirit questions. We asked and waited, but nothing happened. I had a lot of faith something would, but we just weren't able to connect. That same night, I was visited by the spirit again. I wasn't at home that time, but I came home to my apartment trashed. The water running in both my kitchen and bathroom sink, all of my belongings scattered, pictures thrown from the walls, just a complete mess. I got the most depressed feeling I've ever felt. Just an intense sadness. It wasn't over the state of my apartment, it was just from being there. I stayed with Justin a couple nights, but today I have to go back home. I can't live at Justin's, and I need to be home for a number of reasons. I don't know what to expect or do at this point. I feel like I am experiencing the sadness and depression of someone that was a former patient at the hospital, and also their anger from how they were treated before they died, or possibly from me mocking them. I'll admit I'm terrified. I've researched, and paranormal activity as strong as this, strong enough to throw my belongings around, means that this is a very strong spirit. I'm afraid to go to sleep. I'm afraid of what I might wake up to, or what might happen to me while I'm asleep. I will submit a part 2 of my story once I figure out what to do with this situation. My name is Matt. Hopefully I will send in my next entry, and it will be a happy ending with a final conclusion. So this happened to me about 6 or 7 months ago. I was working for a large chain pizza place as a delivery driver. It was actually a good job. I enjoyed it a lot, and the money was really good. I lived in a rural area, but one that was upper middle class, so the tips were usually pretty good. On top of my hourly wage, I almost always made out really well. I worked at this pizza place for about a year and never had any problems. Not until we got a phone call shortly before closing one Saturday night. It's always annoying when a customer calls close to close, but we have to take orders up until close. I answered the phone, and the customer asked how late we were open till. I told them we closed in about 5 minutes. Now 9 times out of 10, when a customer calls 5 minutes before close, they won't place an order. So I became a bit frustrated when the customer said, "Great, I called just in time." Since I had to take their order, I proceeded to ask them what I could get for them. After taking their order and getting their address, I proceeded to tell them I would have their food to them in about 30 to 40 minutes. My manager and I threw together their food as quickly as possible and got it in the oven. As soon as my manager pulled everything out of the oven, I bagged it up as quickly as possible and was out the door. I plugged the customer's address into my Maps app on my phone, and as if my luck couldn't get any worse, it was to one of the more rural neighborhoods we delivered to, about a 10 to 12 minute drive. I drove as fast as I could to the customer's road. I only finally slowed down when my phone said I was getting close. Finally, I arrived at the decrepit-looking house in the middle of nowhere. The house appeared dark, but many customers aren't mindful to turn their porch light on after ordering, so this didn't strike me as odd. I walked up to the front door of the house. The front yard was littered with random parts of cars and other various things. I knocked on the door and waited for the customer to come greet me. I waited about 30 seconds and knocked again. I decided to lean over a bit to my left and try to look through the window to see if I could spot anyone in the house anywhere. As soon as I looked over to the window, I saw 2 eyes peering back at me through the blinds. Of course this startled me, but once we made the eye contact, I assumed they would recognize me as the delivery driver and come to the door. But they didn't come. In fact, they didn't budge. They just kept peering through the blinds at me with this dead-looking stare. At this point, I was beginning to feel quite uncomfortable. Part of me wanted to go back to my car and just leave, but I decided maybe it was just a little kid and their parent didn't hear the door. I certainly didn't want to drive all the way back to the store, only to have to turn around and bring the food back to this person's house. So I decided to knock again. This time I knocked very hard, probably 15 times too. I continued to wait. Still nothing. Still just the eyes peering at me through the window. That's when I decided I was leaving. I walked back to my car, put the pizza bag back on the passenger seat, and proceeded to head down the road to the shop. Almost immediately, I heard this large clunking noise, and my car was driving very weird. It felt like I was driving over speed bumps. I got out of my car, and to my horror, I realized all 4 of my tires had been slashed. Then it hit me. The person staring at me through the window must have been some kind of lookout. I was hoping this was just some kind of messed up prank, but in my gut, I had a feeling this was much more heinous. I decided to call my boss to let him know what was going on. While I was on the phone with him, I saw those eyes again. It was a very haggard-looking middle-aged woman. She was now outside, standing in the middle of the road, maybe 20 feet from my car. We made eye contact again, until suddenly I heard a man shout, "This is perfect!" Before I even had a chance to begin to wonder what the hell that comment meant, I heard footsteps coming up behind me. As soon as I turned around, I was blindsided by the guy, presumably the one who slashed my tires. He charged into me and tackled me hard. He was holding me down. With my phone in my hand, I turned the screen off so the call to my boss wouldn't accidentally be disconnected and quickly forced the phone into my pocket. I was hoping my boss was still on the line, but at this point I had no clue. This man was large and was overpowering me, and if it wasn't bad enough, another man approached us. Together, they carried me into their house. Once inside, I was able to look around. It took me less than a second to realize no one had been living in this house for quite some time. There was no furniture, trash laying about, and there were cobwebs all over the place. I struggled the hardest I could, but it was to no avail. I was exhausted from trying to fight. I really knew this was the end. They carried me down the steps into the basement. It was nearly pitch black. I asked them to please just make this quick. They said they needed to keep me alive for a few days, but would keep me as comfortable as possible. I asked them why. Why keep me alive at all? They said they needed to keep my meat fresh as they consumed it, and couldn't finish consuming me all at once. I decided there was nothing I could do about the situation, accepted my death, and began to pray. One of the men headed upstairs to get the tools they needed to get started. I overheard one of the men mention he was starving. He brought me the food I was originally delivering to them and said I needed to continue to eat this over the next couple days. I felt like I was going to throw up. I had no appetite. I continued to pray until the three of us heard something. Someone was outside. I assumed even more of their friends came to join them. That was until I saw the look of worry on one of the men's faces. He slowly began to work his way up the steps. I heard the ceiling creak as he made his way to the door. What happened next was simply the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. I heard the loveliest music known to man. Suddenly I heard, "Freeze! Police! Put your hands up where I can see them and get on the ground!" I heard more officers rushing around upstairs. And finally, I got the courage to yell, "Here, down in the basement!" At that point, the other men bolted to a window in the basement to try to escape. Then it felt like I was overtaken by a sense of both rage and adrenaline, and I went after the man. I ran up behind him, grabbed him from behind, and slammed him to the ground. He tried to get away, but my newfound, seemingly superhuman strength allowed him to go nowhere. In seconds, the police were downstairs and got the second man in handcuffs as well. As it turns out, both of these men were wanted for suspected kidnapping and murder. Also, the house they called me to deliver pizza had been foreclosed and vacant for years. I'm assuming that's why they chose this location. These men had murdered before and were subsequently convicted of murder. The most amazing part of this story is my boss stayed on the line the whole time to hear what was going on. He looked up the address of the delivery I was taking in the computer and called the cops to give it to them. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be alive. I still work at the same place and have the same manager. We're a lot closer after this. We also only take late night delivery orders if the customer pays with a credit card and meets me at my car. My advice to others, be careful and always trust your gut. Nothing is worth losing your life over. My name is Inwe. I'm female, and at the time of this story I was 15, and this happened to me in January of 2016. I'd gone up to the shopping center that was about a 30-minute walk from my house. I'd taken the bus up there, but it only stops at the shopping center once an hour. While I would usually take the bus home from the shopping center near my house, the bus wasn't due for another 45 minutes by the time I had done what I needed to, and my 10-year-old brother was at home alone. My mom has no problem with me leaving my brother home alone for an hour or two because he can take care of himself for that long. So I decided to walk back to my house instead of waiting basically an hour for the bus. On the way home, I saw a man, maybe 40 to 45 years old, walking in the opposite direction to me. I was walking south and he was walking north. As he turned the corner to walk towards me, I got the impression that he didn't look right. Probably because as he was walking, he was just staring at me. As he walked past me, I got a sinking feeling, like when you're on a plane, it starts to descend. As I continued to walk, I felt like someone was following me. So when I got to the bus stop, I made it look like I was checking the bus times, which gave me an excuse to turn around. And once I did, my heart started racing. This fucker had changed direction and turned 180 degrees to walk in the same direction as me. He was walking faster than he was before, and this freaked me the fuck out. I was close to the road that I would usually turn up to get to my street. I turned up the street and had walked about 25 meters up it when I heard crunching of a chip packet that I knew I had passed. He was still behind me. I decided I'd cross the road to put more distance between us and to also get to the street that was across from me. From here, I could go a longer way home. This longer way home had a lot of corners, making following me a lot harder to do. This street also had a lot of teenagers who were at home due to it being summer holidays, so if the guy tried anything, there were a lot of people who would likely hear me screaming. Now you may be wondering, why didn't you call the police? I'd been stupid and left my phone at the house, so I had no chance of calling the police while walking. Even if I did have my phone, I probably wouldn't have called out of fear of provoking something. I'm about 172 centimeters and weigh 64 kilograms. While my weight is mostly muscle, I'm not large enough to take on someone who's 2 meters tall and look like they weighed twice what I did. So I was going along the long route. When I turned to look behind me, he was still there. This is where I started my plan to get back to my house. I turned the next corner and sprinted along the path as quietly as I could. I was on my house's street. If I was going straight home, I would have gone left. But I went straight ahead towards a smallish park that was just up the street from my house. The reason I did this was because I could go up through the park and around to get to my house. As I was crossing the road to get to the park, I looked back, and I saw him jogging up the path I'd just come from. He saw me and started sprinting towards me. Luckily, I had a 150-meter head start. I ran through the park, up and around to the left. The area behind the park is like a maze, so this gave me an advantage. Once I was behind the park and out of his sight, I continued sprinting for a house that had an old shed in its front yard. The shed was empty and the door was open as always, so I hid in there, able to look out through the mirrored window, and he was looking around for me. He then walked the way that I was planning on going to get to my house. I was still too scared to leave the shed, so I waited for about 10 minutes before I saw him walking back towards the park on his phone, and I heard part of what he was saying on the other end. "Yeah, I lost her, but I think she lives around here. She's a crafty bitch, though." After he passed, I waited another 10 minutes before leaving the shed and sprinting towards my house. I called my mom, who called the police, who, in turn, called me. I gave a description of the man, and refused to leave the house alone for a week. I've never seen him again, and the police report hasn't come up with anything.